If you love Review Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Houghton. So, the Lord Lucan story is one of those real-life mysteries that feels straight out of a movie. I mean, you've got a titled British aristocrat, brutal murder in a posh London townhouse, and then he just vanishes. It's basically the perfect cocktail of drama and scandal and mystery. And the thing is, people are still so into it because there's no proper ending. He was accused of killing the nanny. Some say that he meant to kill his wife, but he got the wrong person, and then he just disappeared. He was gone. No trace whatsoever. And this was back in 1974. And with all the resources and media attention, the fact that no one ever definitively found him is actually kind of wild. Plus, he wasn't some random guy. Lord Lucan was, kind of proper aristocracy. He went to Eton, he had the title, of course, that he'd inherited, and he was part of this very elite gambling set. Keep in mind that back in the 1970s, it was mostly the Arabs who were in London at that time gambling their newfound wealth. And yes, there were British aristocrats doing it, but there weren't that many of them. So this story isn't just a crime story. It's a class and privilege story with potential very high-level cover-ups. And there's always been whispers that his wealthy friends helped him escape or, hide. Some think he actually ended his life. Others believe he was smuggled abroad and lived out the rest of his days under a new identity. And of course, then there's the numerous sightings over the years. He's been spotted in Australia, in Goa, in parts of Africa, even as a monk somewhere, as someone traveled through, kind of the deepest parts of northern India. And some actually say he came to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. People love the idea that he might have pulled off the ultimate disappearing act. So yeah, it's the mystery, it's the glamour of his lifestyle, and it's the incredible darkness of the murder that took place. And that lingering, what if? What if he is your next door neighbor? This is the kind of thing that keeps this story alive. And it's become a real true crime legend at this point. So what do we actually know? On the 7th of November, 1974, his nanny, Sandra Rivett, was found murdered in the affluent neighborhood of London's Belgravia. The prime suspect was the father of her young charges, Lord Lucan. But before the aristocrat could be questioned, he vanished, sparking one of the greatest celeb searches of the 20th century. Look, I've been fascinated with this story since I was a boy, and I just finished reading an amazing book by Laura Thompson titled A Different Class of Murder, and I spoke to her to find out more about the case and what it can tell us about the simmering class tensions in Britain at that time. So I think we can start this story with the night that everything kind of kicked off. Laura, welcome to the show. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. There are so many unknowns in the story of Lord Lucan, but what do we know and what can we say for certain about that night in November 1974?
Yes, surprisingly little is corroborated fact, which is very interesting. This is a case with a very strong mythology around it. What we do know is that in the extremely unlikely environs of London's Belgravia, prime real estate, at a house at 46 Lower Belgrave Street, in the basement of this tall 6-story house, a woman was murdered. Sandra Rivett, age 29, who was the nanny to the 3 young children of Lord and Lady Lucan, who were estranged. They'd been estranged since January 1973. There'd been a very, very bitter custody battle, which Lady Lucan had won. She'd had a succession of nannies, and poor Sandra Rivett was the one in situ on this night. Because the general belief which is almost certainly true, is that she was killed in error, that the intended victim was, in fact, Lady Lucan, the Countess of Lucan, Veronica, who was then 37. And the general belief, which again is probably true, although many other theories are available, is that the man who killed Sandra Rivett by accident in a case of mistaken identity in this darkened basement was Lord Lucan, the 7th Earl Lucan, John Lucan, as he was known to his friends, who was 39, and who then, according to Veronica's account, launched an attack on Veronica herself when she came downstairs to find out what had happened to Sandra.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that and the crime scene itself? You know, what we know for definite about how things unfolded, and was it a lie? Or what can we actually theorize about, you know, things that actually then unfolded?
Well, it was a terrible, terrible crime scene. This poor young woman, Sandra, had been battered badly to death. It was a prolonged struggle. Her body had been placed in a mail sack on the kitchen floor. I mean, it's unspeakable. It sometimes affronts me that the central tragedy of this case can get lost in all the myth that goes around it. So it's very, very important that we remember Sandra. So according to Veronica Lucan, and most of what we know about this case comes from Veronica's testimony, which doesn't mean it's not true. It just means it's her word. According to her, her husband launched an attack on her, again with this piece of ghastly lead piping. She fought him off. There's then an interlude when they went upstairs together and he'd sort of run out of steam and calmed down. And he was seen by his oldest child, Francis. So we know he was there. And then during a moment when he was distracted, Veronica managed to run out of the house and ran down the road to the most English of sanctuaries, the pub, the Plumber's Arms at the end of Lower Belgravia Street. And she burst in there and said, "I've just escaped from being murdered. He's murdered my nanny." And then the police came and an ambulance came and then the whole thing became public. And it fairly quickly became a massive, massive story, as one can imagine, and as it sort of still is.
Can you tell us a bit more about that? Why do you think that the public clamored for this story in the way that they did, and that the press were so eager to feed that hunger?
We have a murder, which I'm afraid we are, most of us, interested in. And then there's this element of the unsolved about this crime, because Lord Lucan has not been seen since the early hours of the 8th of November 1974, and there are people who still think he's alive, and he has been cited in practically every country on earth. It played into that belief, which I think is very strong in this country, that, you know, the establishment can get away with things, the elite can get away with things.
I totally agree. We see it all the time. I did a podcast on the Mitford sisters, and particularly Unity Mitford, after she was sent home to England, after she had spent all this time with Hitler, after really betraying her country. And she was offered, as soon as she arrived back in the United Kingdom, she was offered protection, and there was no recourse for what was effectively treason in everybody's eyes. And this is a very similar story to the elite, you know, looking after their own, to Lord Lucan being looked after. I really want to return to the massive question of Lord Lucan's disappearance and what happened to him later. But before we do, I wonder if we can circle back to the crime and the background and the context. You know, what do we know about Lord Lucan and his background? You know, the kind of man that he was, you know, what was his character like? What kind of picture of this prime suspect can we build?
That's such a great question, because it's very, very hard to answer. I mean, it's very weird writing a book about somebody who's like almost like a black hole.
Can you just explain that?
Well, I just did not know how to get a handle on him. Like many of us, I've grown up with this myth. I mean, there are obviously people today who've never even heard of this case, and that is quite an amazing thought to me, because it was always part of almost like modern folkloric, you know, Lord Lucan, where is he? So not to know anything about it is very interesting, and I'm intrigued to know how sort of Gen Z, what they will make of this story. Because he is like a figure from myth. He had this extraordinary look. I mean, we think of the 70s, we think of, you know, guys with long hair, guys with flares, the whole sort of glam rock or overhang from the hippie era, all this sort of thing. He looked like something from the Edwardian era, really. A very good-looking man. I mean, he was once identified by Cobby Broccoli in a casino, and he said, "That's James Bond." You know, that was what Bond should look like. As a young man, he was incredibly good looking. But I met quite a lot of people who'd known him very well, including like his sister-in-law and brother-in-law, who were wonderful to me and very, very honest about it. And they sort of described this crippling introvert who, it seemed to me, his life was looking like an owl, really. Living like an owl would have done 200 years earlier. He was on an income, like a trust fund income of £12,000 a year, which I suppose now is $250,000 maybe. I mean, very, very nice. But he lived like a multimillionaire.
So beyond his dreams, a facade.
You know, the Belgravia life, he was into powerboats, he was into skiing, winter sports, all this sort of thing. He had Aston Martins. Before he got married, he had the life, you know, it was sort of made in Chelsea for the Harold Macmillan era.
And what about his parents?
His parents were staunch socialists. His father, Pat Lucan, had been the Labour whip in the House of Lords, and his mother was out delivering election literature for the 1974 election, for Labour, of course, on the night that all this happened. But he sort of rebelled against them, and his rebellion took the form of, I'm going to go to Brooks's, and I'm going to live like one of my forebears would have done when we really were masters of the universe. Because an owl with not much money in the late 60s, early 70s, was no different from anyone else. And it's just an aristocratic facade, and he really did fit it.
Did he have connections?
Lord Lucan had some connections who were rich, aristocratic. He himself had very little money. He gambled most of it away. He spent most of his time at the gambling tables at the Claremont Club, which was on Berkeley Square, which used to be run by a friend of his and had recently been sold to Playboy. But anyway, he'd done most of his money there. But lots of people liked him very, very much. And what they said was that it was just the worst possible marriage you could ever have imagined. He married Veronica Lucan in 1963. She was a very pretty young woman, too clever for the life that today she would have had a fulfilling job. She was a really bright young woman, but of course, things were so different then, and what she wanted was to get married. And she married Lord Lucan because he was friends of her sister, Christina, who had married Belgravia, who was a rich man, and et cetera, you know, those traps that women fell into. And she had had mental health issues since childhood. And being married to a man like that and having postnatal depression after these 3 children that she had through the 60s, the whole thing just turned more and more toxic. And if he did commit that murder, which I'm kind of 90% sure he did, I'm not going to put it any higher than that, but that's still pretty high, then he was obviously capable of great evil. But marriage and murder often go together, I'm afraid. And this was an ultimate example of it. And after he walked out of the marriage and after the custody battle, which initially he won because she did have these mental health problems, but she got more evidence and she got doctors to say she'll be fine. She went to the Priory for treatment. And she was put on very strong drugs. And he was out of his mind with worry, which one could also understand. But that's not to exonerate him. It's just to sort of try and give a backdrop to what looks like this random act of violence. In fact, it had been building up and building up and building up.
If we are to go with this central theory that it was, of course, Lord Lucan that did commit the murder, you're suggesting that the motivation was essentially to get his wife that he was estranged from out of the picture. And I suppose the obvious question is, why did he not just divorce her? Or do you think there was a streak, a kind of vengeance in there as well, since they had this, you know, this entire whole bitter, you know, legal battle going on?
Yes, there was hatred there. His sister said that to me. There was a hatred in there. On both sides, I think, although she also always claimed that she was still in love with him. Well, her story changed. That's why I say I'm 90% sure he did it, because her story, which the police said was immutable, in fact did change quite a lot. And she even on one occasion said, I'm not sure who attacked me. I'm not saying I believe that either. But yes, why didn't they get divorced? That was a question I put to quite a lot of people, and nobody could really satisfactorily answer it. Even the police, the Met, who were very sympathetic to Veronica with very good reason, and he became the sort of embodiment of evil, again, completely understandably. Everybody, even they, said nobody really doubts the very strong love he had for his children, to an extent that we would think almost more like a modern father. He was what they called a hands-on father. I can remember talking to a couple of nannies who looked after the children of friends of his. They said, the only one who ever came to the nursery and took an interest was Lord Lucan. Almost like he had this soft side to him that was obviously overlaid by layers of whatever else. But I think what he really wanted was the children.
I think because as he stands, he did intend to murder their mother, his wife, while they were actually in the house. And I think everyone is capable of killing under certain circumstances. And then the answer is quite complex. Psychologically, many studies actually suggest that most people could kill, given extreme enough situations, fear, survival, protection of loved ones, or, under coercion.
I completely agree with you. And it's one of the reasons why I'm not completely sure he did it.
So let's go with your 90%. If we're to indulge the other 10%, as you've said, there's been a lot of mythologizing around the case in the last 50 years since it happened. If we are to entertain some of those other theories about who committed the murder, who's actually in the frame?
Well, I'm afraid I have to say that two people said to me that they thought Veronica had done it. I mean, these were two people who knew her very, very well. And they said their initial reaction was, oh my God, Veronica's killed the nanny. Either to incriminate Lucan or because she sometimes thought that the nannies at the house were in league with him and reporting back to him about her alleged incompetence in order to get that custody judgment overturned, which had become his great obsession. At the time, the reporting, he became almost like this kind of national scapegoat. Britain in 1974 was not a very happy place to be. A high cost of fuel, instability, terrorism, IRA terrorism, inflation, etc. Britain was not a happy place. And this man who came along and whose work was sitting at the Claremont Club playing backgammon and who looked like this ultimate sort of seigneurial figure from the kind of person you just long to see brought low. And he did, I think that's a lot of the reason why the case took such a hold on the press, because the press knew that the public were hating this guy, which I completely understand.
He's an easy target for a villain.
And when you read the newspaper coverage, and of course the press were hand in glove with the police, when you read the coverage, you completely understand the pleasure that it would have generated, this kind of sort of pleasurable rage that people would have felt, when they're struggling to heat their homes and there's this guy lording about and killing a servant as if it means nothing, So the fact that nobody else ever entered the frame as a potential killer, and it wasn't a terribly well-run investigation, the forensics were pretty kindergarten. There was blood where it shouldn't have been, and the murder weapon was lost, and they had to eliminate about 50 sets of fingerprints from Met police who fancied having a look at whether this aristocratic monster had committed murder. And nobody ever knew which of those fingerprints were indeed, if any of them, were Lord Lucan's, because his were never identified. I mean, it really was like, we know who this is, we've just got to find this swine.
So if we turn now to the second part of the case, as it were, and probably the reason why it has actually been so enduring, the disappearance of Lord Lucan over the last 50 years. The same question really as my first question to you. What can we say for certain about that? When was he last seen or heard from for absolutely certain?
Very little corroborated. We only really know he was at the house because his daughter saw him. I don't like anything unless there's two people involved to back each other up in their story. We know he made a couple of phone calls, and one was to a nearby friend who hung up on this weird-sounding bloke. The second was to his mother by the time she got home, which was, please go and get my children out of that house. And what he supposedly said to his mother, the Dowager Countess, was, "Mother, there was something terrible in the basement. I couldn't bear to look." Which is, if that's true, and I don't think she would have made that up, that is such an ambivalent and terrible statement. Anyway, she did then go to the house and take the children to her flat. We don't know where those phone calls were made. It wasn't a public call box. He had a flat nearby, but the police said, well, he can't have made them from there because there's no blood in this flat. But there was no blood in lots of places in that house, the murder house. You know, the blood evidence is very, very confusing. You know, you just long for modern forensics, a bit of CCTV. Anyway, he supposedly tried to get hold of his brother-in-law in London, who wasn't at home. But then he drove out to Sussex, to a place called Uckfield, where another friend, Ian Maxwell Scott, lived. And his wife was at home, Susie Maxwell Scott. Again, we only have her word for anything that happened, that Lucan turned up, but I'm pretty sure he was there because he wrote a couple of letters there and they were posted and they had the Uckfield postmark. And she didn't come forward with this story that he'd been there. When the Uckfield postmark was identified, she fessed up and said, oh, yes, he was with me. And partly her demeanour led to this idea that people are covering up for him, which I completely understand. She behaved very peculiarly. And some bloke came out of the woodwork and said to me, oh, yeah, my dad used to work for Susie Maxwell Scott. He was told to drive a person to an airfield in Kent. I mean, it was a good story.
I mean, that sounds plausible, but then why not come forward with the information in the first instance? So we know he was there. We're pretty sure that he was at the Maxwell Scotts. Do we know what happened to him then? Did Susie Maxwell Scott say anything about what happened and where he went next? Or does he just disappear into the ether?
Well, what he told her was the same story as he wrote in a letter to his brother-in-law, Bill Shankid, who was married to Christina, who was Lady Lucan's sister. And the same story, which is along the lines of, I was walking past the house, number 46, Lower Belgravia Street, and I saw in the basement a man who appeared to be struggling with Veronica, and I raced in and the man raced off. What he said to Bill and to Susan Maxwell Scott was, Veronica accused me of hiring this man to kill her. And I sometimes wonder myself whether he had hired someone and then went there, maybe got cold feet, something like that. Too many people said to me he was squeamish. He would never have physically been able to do it, but they could imagine him hiring someone. And of course, going to casinos, that sort of thing. It wouldn't have been difficult to find someone, I don't think. So that, if we're talking who's in the frame for the murder, to me, that's always seemed quite a plausible solution. It doesn't explain everything. And actually, nothing explains everything. But to me, it has a kind of, if you like, psychological plausibility. So then what we know is that he drove off from Susan's. We don't know what time. We don't know if he was driving the car. That's the other thing. He borrowed this car from another friend. And then the car was seen the next morning in the early hours in Newhaven, parked in some obscure residential road, looking completely blameless in Newhaven, although the interior was described as looking a bit dirty, and they were like smudges of blood. And of course, Newhaven's a port. And of course, that you might think of as Journey's End. And he did write another letter to the man from whom he had borrowed the car. And that to me always reads a bit like a suicide note. He said, you know, if you see my children, as I hope you will, tell them all I cared about was them. And to me, it always has the air of a signing off, but, you know, that's me.
So what are some of the theories, perhaps not your own, about what happened to Lucan after that? And where has he been essentially since he disappeared?
Well, there are lots of theories. There really are. The most straightforward is that he got on a ferry at Newhaven because there weren't obviously the checks like there would be today. And there was a stray paragraph in a newspaper where it said a couple of men, trawler men, had seen this unusually well-dressed looking gentleman. And I always thought, I wonder if that was him. And then he jumped off and got caught up in the propellers or some such thing. But of course, no body has ever been found. There are stories along the lines of the one I mentioned, that he was taken off to a private plane, that he was just got out of the country. He did have a friend in Spain. He was seen in the first sightings were in northern France, and the police and the press all went herring off to Cherbourg. Is he here? Is he there? It's all a bit Scarlet Pimpernel, and yet at the same time, you feel bad for making light of it. But there is that it's a very English sort of extremely dark humour that has infected this story, I think.
Where do you think he went if indeed he didn't commit suicide?
The most usual place for seeing him, where he's been cited, oh Lord, so many times, is an African country, Botswana, Kenya, Mozambique, South Africa, etc., take your pick. He's been seen in Australia. He's been seen working as a waiter. He's been seen, in a gym. He's been seen directing traffic. He's been seen, it's just lunatic, most of the theories.
But do you think there's any plausibility to the idea that he did make it abroad and kind of lived out his days in hiding?
See, I don't know what he's been living on, because he was declared bankrupt quite soon after all this happened. In order to chase the money to take that custody case back to the High Court, he had been gambling. It's never overly sensible to call yourself a professional gambler. But if you keep a cool head, which he did in the early days, you can make an income of sorts. He was a good backgammon player. He was a good blackjack player.
What about the custody case?
After the custody case, once he lost, his gambling did go very, very, very wild, because, it's elementary. Once you're chasing money, you start losing. And he was in debt all over the place. You look at the figures, it's horrifying. I remember one of the coppers saying to me, when the bills are unopened, there's trouble. Because when they went to the flat, they just found all this unopened mail. To me, he'd reached the end of the line in every respect. And most murders where people try to kill a spouse, they're usually about money. They're usually because they don't want to keep paying out for this person that they hate, whom they think is ruining their life and taking their children. And an earl with money wouldn't have needed to do that. They could just flash off and live in the south of France. But an earl without money had no power. This is where I peel away from the Lucan mythology, because to me, he just looked like establishment. He wasn't really establishment. The people spending money at the Claremont Club were Arabs. They were the people with the money in London in the early 1970s. And a few rich aristocrats and a few rich businessmen. But that was not Lucan's circle on the whole. Bill Shankid was a rich man, but he was a respectable man. The idea that he would have been party to a flight from justice is laughable. So he either knew rich, respectable people, or he knew people like himself who'd lost all their money gambling. So I don't know who would have, other than John Aspinall, who used to own the Claremont Club but had sold out, and who might have enjoyed, I'll get Lucky Lucan out of the country and that'll be jolly, that frightful wife of his. And he did do a lot of damage, John Aspinall, by talking that way. To me, it's like a ghastly tease, enjoying stringing along the credulous hacks, the credulous coppers. But it could have been. But getting that is one thing, and then how's he going to live? Is someone really going to bankroll him? Possibly for 50 years? To me, it's just implausible.
So having looked at this case and in so much depth, then as you say, having spoken to the people who knew Lord Lucan well and who were involved in the case, what do you think happened after the night when he disappeared?
But I can see that it fits that idea of people like him can get away with things. And that's why it's so satisfying, because it fits this mythology that's grown up around the case.
And that's what you think? You think that he killed himself?
I think he killed himself that night. I think he was a very weak man. He was not a dashing gambler, really. He wasn't, I'll give it a shot, I'll see if I can get away. He was a man who gambled as almost like a retreat from reality, it seems to me. Living this aristocratic construct from the 18th century. What a strange way to live your life. And when the facade fell apart, and if he had planned to kill his wife and then had killed this other girl, so it wasn't just evil, it was evil and in his logic, as it were. And he knew that people would say, well, if he didn't do it, why did he run? And that is an extremely good question. And it was answered to me by a couple of people because he knew that Veronica would always win. She won the custody case, even though there was quite a lot of evidence on both sides, good and bad. It was fairly evenly weighted, in fact, but she won. She persuaded the judge. The judge thought he was the worst man ever once she'd finished. And as I say, maybe he was. If I'm right in my reading of it, and there was about a marriage that went horribly wrong and about the children as the kind of spoils of war, as it were, it just becomes a lot more interesting, I think. And that's why I think he killed himself, because I think he knew that if he'd done it for the sake of his children, he had surely lost them for good. And that's why I think that last letter is a signing off.
Whether he threw himself into the sea or whether he hopped aboard a plane and went for a new life elsewhere, Lucan kind of vanishes from the picture at that point. But there is an interesting piece to this story, isn't there? In that over the last 50 years since this case unfolded, in that it has continued to impact people's lives. I'm thinking particularly of his son here. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the afterlife and its legacy.
Oh, terrible. I mean, imagine. You read about Sandra's inquest in 1975 and her poor parents saying, we've been forgotten here. This has all become about Lord Lucan and Lord and Lady Lucan, and where's Sandra in the middle of all this? And then Lucan had 3 children, George, Francis, Camilla, and George couldn't even get his father declared dead so he could inherit the title, which he wanted to do as a kind of closure almost. But that's quite a thing to have grown up with. That's quite a legacy. And I mean, Lady Lucan's life, it really does fill you with quite a lot of sadness. She became estranged from her children. That was her doing. She would give interviews saying, oh no, I no longer want to see them anymore. And then poor Sandra, this poor young woman, sort of caught in the crossfire of this marriage.
And I guess finally, Laura, if we are to look back at this 50 years, does it have historical significance? I think quite often, true crime is dismissed as kind of lowbrow and not real history. But what do you think we can actually learn from this case?
I think true crime is real history. I think these murders that endure, it's so often because they do encapsulate a time. It is that clash of his ridiculously antediluvian lifestyle and the way the modern world was moving. This says a lot about that era, I think. It says so much about, how our attitudes to class were evolving. Not disappearing, that I'm afraid we haven't got there yet, but they were evolving and shifting. I just think it's interesting with the perspective we have now to look at it anew. Then we were watching Upstairs, Downstairs. Now we watch Saltburn. It doesn't go away. It just sort of shapeshifts. And he was just this lost soul in the era of a Britain that was societally changing so much. He couldn't command deference in life anywhere but at those gambling clubs, really. And I find the thought of this happening at that time, I think, is peculiarly powerful. And I think it really does say a lot about that and about the press reaction to him, the public reaction to him, the way Lady Lucan was perceived almost in a feminist light, which wouldn't have been the case earlier.
It really shows how social class can seriously shape the way crimes are handled, both by the justice system and in the public eye. Lucan wasn't just some guy. He was an Eton-educated aristocrat, part of the British upper crust. When he was suspected of killing the nanny and attacking his wife, the whole situation didn't unfold the way it might have if he'd been, say, a working class bloke. The police were actually criticized for being very slow and hesitant. There were even whispers that his wealthy friends kind of helped him disappear. And that's not just something that anyone can pull off. Then there's how the media ran with it. Instead of focusing solely on the crime, they actually built this whole mysterious legend around him. For decades, he was actually treated like this tragic romantic figure, where he was spotted in exotic places rather than effectively what he was, which was just a suspected murderer. And that kind of narrative, much more likely when the person involved is rich, titled, and part of a powerful social circle. So yeah, stories like this really highlight how being part of the elite can twist how justice is served or avoided, and how the public ends up remembering someone. And a big thank you to Laura Thompson, my guest this afternoon, and her new book, A Different Class of Murder. And I'm sure we'll still be talking about this case 50 years from now. Bye for now.